Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is the increasing prevalence of STDs and the possibility of there being a particular factor that is behind that increased prevalence. A rather disconcerting case study, and slime molds that act as a collective despite being single-celled organisms. This, along with a variety of interesting and unusual astronomical news. You can find the timestamps for each of these and other news items in the description box below. Let's start with STDs, or sexually transmitted diseases. These are things like gonorrhea, chlamydia, and so on. Perhaps the best known of these is syphilis, particularly because not only can it be treated with antibiotics, but for a long time, the treatment was actually mercury. STDs are, as the name would suggest, transmitted via sex, although technically any bodily fluid can do it. It just happens to be that sex is the primary mechanism and means by which it is spread. The CDC reports on this, that things like gonorrhea and syphilis have gone up 10% and 7% since 2019. That's a pretty large jump. Not only do you need to worry about the transmission of STDs between consenting adults, if you're infected with an STD, there is a reasonable chance that newborn children could also acquire the same disease. This can occur because it's congenitally acquired while they're in utero, or while they're being born. That increased by 15% since 2019, and more than 200% since 2016. These are pretty big numbers, and the increase is a big issue. Not only because STDs are increasingly difficult to control, but because the fact that they need to be controlled and aren't being means that the complications arising from them will only get worse. The UK, for instance, is having considerable trouble with gonorrhea, where there are a number of strains that are medication resistant. The CDC attributes a great deal of the observed increase in prevalence to things like a lapse in health insurance, the fact that people aren't attending medical clinics in order to get treatment, a lack of laboratory supplies and consumables, and the worsening socio-economic environment for many people. This led to an increase in the number of people who acquired STDs, weren't able to either be diagnosed or treated, and, to be quite blunt, number of people staying home and finding their own ways to occupy time. Going from the clinically relevant STDs to a case study that's, frankly, rather uncomfortable. The 53-year-old French male presented to an emergency department with eye discomfort. What it turns out is that the eye discomfort was caused by maggots that had been transferred to his eye and tried to take up residence there. The way this works is that the flies in question are the botfly. They're well known for trying to breed in things like feces and for laying their eggs on unsuspecting animals. The fact the farm where this man was is a sheep and horse farm contributes to what would happen. These animals are particularly known to be ideal targets for the botfly. It's likely that the botfly mistook the human eye for a sheep eye and tried to lay its eggs there, which then turned into maggots. These would have then eventually begun to grow and, if the farmer had not sought medical care, begun to consume him, slowly, little bit by little bit, starting with his eye. Treatment is relatively straightforward. You physically remove the maggots with a pair of tweezers and then provide a topical treatment as a barrier and antibiotics to prevent infection. Unfortunately, the case study doesn't give a great deal of detail on follow-up, but as you can imagine, it's not exactly something that you would want to read too deeply into. Next, we go from the small botfly larvae to mold. It's a weird examination of how a particular slime mold acts collectively, despite the fact that each cell individually is its own organism. Take, for example, your basic bacterium. Any of them will live individually, and collectively they don't get along very well as they compete for the same resources. Compare that with the human body. All the cells in your body, despite being drastically different, all work collectively to keep you alive. Somehow, life went from single-celled, very basic organisms that are even more simple than bacteria, to the complexity of yourself. And this is where the weird examination of Fonticula alba could provide some degree of elucidation and information around how we went from simplicity to complexity. The mold is able to work as a collective to be able to break through bacterial colonies, and from there they begin consuming them at an individual level. The mold in question has interesting phenomena. One of the things it does is that it creates filaments that are almost like those found in mold. For example, like mushrooms, where the rhizomes are spread out and then fruiting bodies form. In the same way, these single-celled organisms also happen to become collectives, where they form a mound to release spores. Remembering though, that these are single-celled organisms, they can replicate individually. The fact they do it this way is truly weird, and as pointed out, it is strange to look at how they would need these structures and how they work, since, for example, those hyphae, or the tendrils that come out, have one leading cell, and then others that follow behind. It could provide much insight as to how organisms develop their complexity, but particularly how things like fungus began to grow. Going from something you see through a microscope to something you can see through a telescope, and even without. The alignment of Saturn, Mars, Venus and Jupiter in the middle of this month. Unfortunately, this event is only available to those who live in the Northern Hemisphere. It's the alignment of Saturn, Mars, Venus and Jupiter. It's also unfortunately not associated with the actions of a doomsday cult trying to gain unlimited power, as Tomb Raider might make you think. The alignment begins around the 17th of April and will reach its optimal setting for those 4 planets around the 20th. If you want to see something even more amazing, on the 23rd, the moon will also line up with these 4, admittedly with a considerably greater distance between it than the others. While still looking to the skies, NASA has confirmed that the largest ever comet has been detected. Considering the size of space and the fact that it's likely that the moon was something knocked out of Earth while it was still forming, space has some pretty large structures, but anything of the size of the moon tends to get caught up in other planets' orbit. The comet in question is considerably smaller than most of the celestial bodies you might think of. It's about 140 kilometers or 85 miles wide. This is very large, and there are very few things that are this size, either because generating them is hard during the development of the universe, or because they tend to eventually crash into something that is going to win the fight. Consider how cratered the moon is, and that Earth has experienced several mass extinctions as a result of asteroids and comets touching ground. The final news we have for you this week regards Perseverance and its time on Mars. Perseverance landed in the middle of February 2021. It's been moving around for some time. What's interesting is that the system that got Perseverance to land safely on Mars has only just now been spotted. This tells you how slowly and carefully the rover has been moving across the Martian surface. One of the reasons why it wasn't observed earlier is that the rover had to take a significant detour due to hazardous terrain, As a result, although it's now been seen, the fact is that it's taken a long time, and unfortunately the rover can't get any closer to see how effectively the landing system worked. The basic system landed effectively, and we know that because Perseverance has been active, but the fact that we weren't able to see the parachute or the back shell, major parts of the landing system, until now, tells you how far away they landed. It's also important to note that Perseverance's travel speed is approximately 180 meters an hour. In reality, due to the terrain having to move to the left and the right and go up and down hills, the actual linear distance travelled is significantly less than that each day, at about 100 meters to up to 200 meters each day. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.